it gives way higher. They pay Amaranth more than $10 million a year. No, it's documented. She makes $18 million on OnlyFans alone. Right, but do you know how she promotes her OnlyFans? On Kick. She just sits there and looks nice on Kick and says, go to OnlyFans.
I know, but
We're not considering that.
I think I wanted.
I know. We're not considering that. We're talking about a streamer.
Yeah, I don't like the girl.
Okay. Well, be a Superman and go watch this fucking interview. Let's
Right now, later. Really good show. Really
Caspian, see you changed your avatar. May I ask why? Hold on. I'll tell you what, I recognize you with the other one a lot better because it looks like you. This one doesn't look like you, so it's like, who's that? Like you come in and I don't recognize you. Not that that's a big deal, but so asking, why don't you just ask um Riser to do the one like he did, but with this the third eye with the switch or whatever.
thank you, but I know how to
Okay,
use that.
okay, cool. Oh, you just changed it. Looks great. Like I see that and it's fucking recognizable as shit because it looks like you, and it's cool because it's like a cartoon, but yet it still looks like you. Not that I don't like the other one, but to be honest with you, I couldn't really tell what it was. But don't trust my vision. But even still, even on like a larger thing, it's kind of that switch is a little small. But this one's baller. I'm telling you, when you start going like you really start branding that look, but with a circle around it in green that says Caspian Sea and then Linktree / Caspian Sea, like the top arch which says Caspian Sea and then the bottom arch is
It's too great. Right?
oh dude, I didn't tell you. We had this chick who came in here the other day. She's really cool. Um, let's just say she gave one hell of a trip. One
That's hilarious.
one for the record books, people. And it was amazing. She's really cool. I even shouted her out in that video. The guy's talking over me when I'm saying her name, but yeah, she's a streamer on Kick. And you know how she found out about me? I think this is how. I was just live in one of these fucking uh, daddy Discord or mommy Discord or I Show Speed or one of them, and she said I know that person because she knew me from Kick, and so she knew me from Kick, and then she saw that I was live streaming, so she pressed the Discord and then came in and everything. And she's really cool. I mean, I think she she can be a regular, meaning like she's not just here for one. Like she's come back a couple times. Oh, with me? No, 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 no. I know who I'm marrying. It's not that person. Uh, I mean, we'll probably fuck in the future if digital immortality is not a thing. But no, she's in a relationship basically with some. I don't want to say who, but she basically has a friend. Um, no, no. I, pardon me? Oh yeah. No, 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 no. But yeah, that was interesting. And what else? I've had to create robots to simulate um my presence in chat rooms to gain VC experience. So basically, like in order to stream in like Chill Zone or Chill Bar, um, you have to like, or even Daddy or Mommy, you have to do a certain amount of chatting, and or I Show Speed was the same thing. I told you how I did with I Show Speed. Basically, for that one, for 8 fucking hours straight, I basically had to spam at least a few times a minute, like some kind of GIF of him. Well, these are different. These chats don't move as quickly, and they have moderators who are right there. So I actually have a couple different bots going for certain chats, and so it's very funny. This system that I have, I bought a chat, and I send emojis. The emojis are like like uh, they're the least expressive thing without saying a sentence over and over and over again. So I'll send like a heart or like a smiley face or whatever, and then it'll be like a heart, a smiley face, and then I say sending positive vibes, and you can spam sending positive vibes a lot. And the reason why is if anybody says, isn't it? If anybody says, dog, why are you spamming that? You're like, what kind of douchebag confronts the person sending positive vibes. So long as it's not like every other fucking message, it's just once every 10 minutes. What the fuck is wrong with that? And what the fuck is your problem? Like, so I haven't gotten any shit. Exactly. Exactly. And then in between there, either a smiley face or a heart to keep it lively. And then what happens, it's so funny. People start to get the pattern that it's like, oh, here comes a heart, and then here comes a smiley face. Though sometimes the color of the heart changes, and sometimes it's a different smiley face. But then it says sending positive vibes, and then people will respond to it. They don't know that my account is linked to that, so it sends me a message. Hey, so and so just mocked you by sending positive vibes back or whatever. Or they're really nice and they just say sending positive vibes back or whatever. And I can say, oh, thank you so much, and they're like, oh, you're real. Oh, like or like some people will test me. Some people will be like, tell me you're not a bot right now, and I'll be like, I'm not a bot, and they'll be like, oh, I'm so sorry, sending positive vibes back to you. But that's like the perfect. It's the perfect phrase that you can spam it and not get in trouble. If you spam sending positive vibes and then a couple of emojis, that you can let that robot go basically indefinitely, and nobody's really gonna have too big of an issue with it. And so long as it's not constant. When you get into multiple spams a minute, nobody fucking wants that. When you spam, then you spam again, and you spam again, and spam it stops. But if it's once every 10 minutes, and then I can sleep with that bot on, and nobody fucks with me, that's what it's about. Definitely. Um, yeah. So I've got of these bots. Let's see. Oh, I have to tell you, they came up with a phrase for me. Okay, so what is it called what I'm doing when you just turn on your camera and sit there? Like to me that's not like a thing. That's like kind of new. But it's called VC camping. It's called VC camping, which is like okay, I get it. You're gonna use gamer phrase or whatever to get me. Okay. But so at least in iShow Speed, they're saying like and they say all the time like this person's VC camping. And I say to them, where in the rules does it say that you can't VC, quote unquote, VC camp? If you're going to have an extensive list of rules that you can and can't do, then VC camping should be in there, in my opinion. If it's a, so I say to them, it's fine if you don't want me to be there. Absolutely. I understand. But you have a list of 15 rules. Make it 16. If you don't, it looks like you're picking on me because I'm following all 15 of your rules. And I am. I'm not doing anything. Look, I'm the king of fucking. Uh, I'm the king of publicity. I'm the king of self promotion. I don't do that in here. So, of any one that I should have broken, it's that one. You want to get me with VC camping, like, and you're making that up. That's not a. That's like. That's not a rule that you have. That's literally. This is what happened. One person came up with that phrase. I don't know if it was in here. I'm sure it's been used other places. But then they spread it to the moderators, and now the moderators start using that phrase. And I explained to them, and that's fine if you want to consider it bad. You know what normally happens? They just kick you out of the VC, and if you come back, then you're fine. So I don't know if you saw in that video, but I created a robot that if I get kicked, I come right back. So their fucking VC camping doesn't count. So then they just permaban me, which is like, you go from 0 to 100 with this fucking permaban. And I'm serious about this. When I have a chance to be able to speak to the world about technology, the permaban will be illegal. This is how it will work. If you want to ban someone, you have to reban them once a year, annually. And you have to manually go in and say that I want to ban this person again for another year. If not, their ban goes away and they get another chance. Because if not, you could have a situation where you have someone who goes to jail for 5 years, they paid their debt to society, and yet they're still banned from your whatever group 15 years later because one moderator made their decision 15 years ago. That moderator is long gone. It just doesn't make any sense. What I'm saying is the punishments are too harsh. Pardon me? One more time?
And
You understand? Excellent. Yeah. Um, and I think that it'll be a thing. That it'll just be like everybody has just a day where they take an hour at the beginning of the year. You know how you do like people do their taxes? Well, just before January 1st every year, You would just take an hour and just make sure all the shit that you banned the previous year you want to continue to ban. And if you want to give people a second chance, you can. And if you don't ban that shit, then it just the ban goes away, and you can always ban them again. It's not like you, but that way, it because here's the thing: a lot of people who you ban just for whatever reason, it was your fault. You were in a bad mood or whatever. It's not their fault, and just the punishment is too great. And anyway, that's just how I feel about the matter. Okay, so we've been watching these history of Judaism podcasts. So if you hear me listen to that, that's what we're doing, baby.
The fourth section is Ezekiel or damages.
I'm glad you're back.
Nashim, study section of and especially the Talmud, on which the Talmud is really essentially an extended commentary of the Mishnah, as we'll discuss in next week. Ezekiel deals with damages like torts, civil law, criminal law, things like this. Reuben's cow eats the grass in Shimon's porch, and Shimon's porch falls in, and Reuben's cow or goat breaks essentially the temple rituals, holy things. And Tahara deals with the complex laws of maintaining ritual purity for several of the functions involved in the temple in particular. So that's basically the content of the Mishnah. It forms an acronym in Aramaic, Man Nakat, which means time flies or time is taken, which is an easy way to remember all six of them. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of Mishnaic debate is the fact that since it involves the opinion of so many rabbis, it is quite intentionally ambiguous in nature, meaning Rabbi Yehuda Nasi rarely clarified, what is the bottom line. A typical Mishnah will read, Rabbi X says that this kind of chicken is kosher. Rabbi Y will say this kind of chicken is not kosher. And that's the end of it. Then you'll go on to something else. And so here you are, if you're trying to read a law book, a law code, you're saying, well, which one is it? Do we accept the opinion of Rabbi X, or do we accept the opinion of Rabbi Y? The Mishnah rarely says what Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi feels is the correct text. And so as a general norm, rejected opinions are cited in this text. This is something which is really quite fascinating and speaks to the root of Jewish culture, because in the very, very foundation of this important document, debate is essential. The only way you can really engage this text properly is by arguing about, okay, well, what are the grounds for Rabbi X's opinion? What are the grounds for Rabbi Y's opinion? Perhaps Rabbi Y was speaking out of a particular circumstance. Perhaps Rabbi X was speaking under the assumption that certain factors were pertaining to the situation or to the chicken and so on. So it means that the only way you can really learn Mishnah properly is dialogue, which is later expressed in commentary. That's essentially what the Talmud is going to be, as we'll speak about next week. The Mishnah also is not a typical law code in that a lot of non-legal material is also included within it. Most famous, perhaps, is the tractate known as Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the Fathers, which is an absolutely brilliant and soaring discussion of Jewish philosophy and ethics, which is ritually studied every year as an incredible, basis for Jewish thought and morality. So, in conclusion, the Mishnah is a work of subtle genius. The fact that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi left it so often open-ended and left it rather unfinished in nature meant that the only way that Jews could deal with this is through being involved. It's not a kind of text where you can read it once and understand what's going on. Every passage has to be puzzled over, and perhaps more importantly, every passage should be debated, which requires an interlocutor. It requires someone else. It requires a chavrusa, a study partner, to engage in the text together. This formed the basis of Jewish study, requiring Jews to live close together and to be attracted to people who were able to explicate this complex document. And in a way, this book was essential to preserving both the oral quality of the oral Torah, because it required that active human interface, and it also preserved the vitality of the Jewish people and allowed them to keep their Judaism even under the trying circumstances of the diaspora. So that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to speaking with you on the next topic. Hello, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the first lecture. I got some really great feedback, and it was really helpful for me to get a sense of how to design these classes better. So today we're going to go into the first real historical lecture. The lecture that you just listened to was a little bit more theoretical about historiography as opposed to history per se, and now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. My goal for today is to really go over two things. First of all, to give you kind of a lightning review of Jewish history from the beginnings of time all the way up until the beginnings of the first millennium, the year zero. And then we're going to go from there. We're going to look a little bit at Jewish sectarianism. I want to give you a sense of the diversity of Jewish thought at the beginning of the first millennium. So that's our goal for today, those two things. Let's get started. So here you see in the cover image a really interesting kind of thing. It's a mural from the Dura Europa synagogue, which is a 3rd century synagogue that was unearthed in rather remarkably good condition. And as you can see, it's a great example of Hellenistic Judaism. It's a great example looking at the influence of Hellenism on Jewish thought and practice. This is a scene in the synagogue that depicts the rescue of Moses from the Nile River by Bat Paro, the daughter of Pharaoh. You can see her there at the bottom of the screen, tastefully edited by my little block there. But in the background, you can so obviously they had no problem with nudity and things like this in synagogues. But if you look at the style of representation, they all essentially look like Middle Eastern, really Greek women with the almond-shaped eyes and things like that. And that's the sort of two-dimensional framing, the expressions, all this sort of stylistic devices, a clear influence of Greek culture, which is normal. I mean, after all, the Jews were living in a very Greek culture at the time. And that's going to be the underlying theme of today's class. First of all, let's talk a little bit about our sources for Jewish history. Like, what exactly are our sources for Jewish history? First of all, we have the Bible, the Torah, perhaps better phrased the Tanakh, which refers to the 3 sections of the Hebrew Scriptures. That is the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, followed by the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and finally by the Ketuvim, or writings, which cover things like Proverbs and Psalms and things like that. And it's a fantastic source with all kinds of amazing information, and it really is the first go-to source for any of the information we're going to look at in the ancient period. Unfortunately, it is not intended by its authors as a historical source. I mean, the prophets and so on, when they recorded those things, they were not necessarily intending to give us a modern, critical historical account of what happened in the ancient period. The primary goal of the works of Nach in particular are spiritual edification, to teach us spiritual lessons and to try to advance the cause of Jewish values and so on. So it's great for gathering information, but it should not be considered a history book per se. Secondly, we have the so-called Pseudegrapha and Apocrypha. These are works which are ancient, usually of Jewish authorship, but they didn't make it into the Tanakh. For various reasons, sometimes discussed in the Talmud, for example, these books were debated. Do they have sufficient spiritual content? Are they in line with mainstream thinking on Judaism? In fact, some books like Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, were actually debated and made it into the Tanakh. Others were debated and did not make it into the Tanakh. For example, Ben Sira. And these books are sometimes included in other Bibles, like, for example, the Catholic Bible has some really interesting books that the Jewish Bible does not include. And I'm not talking here about the so-called New Testament, which is the Christian scriptures per se. They're books like Judith and Tobit and First and Second Maccabees, which were considered external books or exterior books by the Jews. They were considered, integral to other traditions, and they were in fact incorporated into non-Jewish Bible. But these kinds of texts, like the biblical texts, were intended primarily to, impart an edifying message, cannot be considered appropriately as historical sources, but they do have historical data that we can use. Finally, we have scattered sources in various non-Jewish documents, archaeological finds, and things like that. And these are of somewhat dubious value as well. First of all, there are not so many of them. There's clearly the first source to go to are intrinsic Jewish sources, but there are occasional references in ancient Egyptian literature, Greek literature, and Roman literature, which can shed valuable light on Jewish history. Obviously, they're highly tendentious, often trying to cast the Jews in a particular light. This is the seal of the pharaoh Merneptah, the earliest reference found to Jews in a non-Jewish source, and it dates from the 13th century before the Common Era. And there's the phrase, Israel is wasted, its seed exists no more. Rather nasty kind of doomsday statement. But if we look over here, okay, so this is what Israel's seed looks like today. Okay, interesting, nice, happy children. It's the Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day celebration there. And this is what the author, this is what the pharaoh Merneptah looks like. Not so good. Let's have a look at the end. Here's Israel's seed, which according to the pharaoh is wasted and no more. And let's look at the pharaoh. I mean, I'm just saying. Okay, let's go on. So, anyways, let's go quickly through the First Temple period, and this is going to be a lightning flash through quite a few centuries of history. We begin with the conquest of Canaan, which is described in the last section of the Torah and the first few books of Nach, specifically Joshua and then Judges, and then we move from there rather rapidly into the monarchy, the establishment of the first Jewish king, known as King Saul, which then handed over to his son-in-law, King David. In fact, that takes up most of the description of the book of Samuel, and then it's handed over to David's son Solomon, Shlomo, and that goes into the book of Kings and so on. After the monarchy is established, we have its dissolution into two states, two divided kingdoms, Judah in the south and Israel in the north. I'm going to show you a map of that shortly. Then in the late 8th century, a terrible tragedy strikes as the northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrians, and the 10 northern tribes are taken away into captivity and lost forever. This is the source of the famous 10 lost tribes of Judaism. And it's interesting, if you follow the history of the idea of the 10 lost tribes, there are all kinds of peoples, including, for example, the British people, American Indians, African tribes who have descended from and lost tribes. Might be some interesting things actually coming out of DNA research right now. But moving on from there, the most important event afterwards is the 6th century destruction of all of Israel by the Babylonians, and then the carting away of a good chunk of the population to Babylon in particular. They are there for about 70 years before they are allowed to return and rebuild the temple. Most Jews stayed in Babylon, but quite a few returned to Israel and created a second temple, and there was a Jewish Renaissance. So if you have a look at the maps here, here's a map of the divided kingdoms of Judah and Israel. You can see that Judah is in the Judean desert and southward towards the Negev. The kingdom of Israel is further north in the region of today's Shomron, the Galil, and even extended across the Jordan River into contemporary Jordan. Here's a map of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, period in which the Jews were carted off there. And leaving from places like Judah, towards the left, moving over into the Mesopotamian region. The word Mesopotamia means between the rivers. It refers to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, not shown here, but they sort of go diagonally down from the center of the map into the Persian Gulf, what would be today contemporary Iraq, ending in Kuwait. And the Jews set up several cities or several villages, which later grew into cities along this next few hundred years, as we will discuss in later lectures. This is kind of an interesting little thing. This is a piece of pottery that was discovered in Israel around this time of the Renaissance of Jews after the return under Ezra in the 6th century. And it's written in the Old Hebrew script, and the text reads, belonging to Yehoshma, daughter of Shamash Shar Usur. So the Yehoshma is a Jewish name, meaning God will listen in Hebrew. And Shamash Shar Usur is a man's name that refers explicitly to a Babylonian god. So it's kind of an interesting document because it shows that the daughter of this signet had a Hebrew name with a clear reference to the Jewish god, but her father, who was not so pro, had a Babylonian name. And I think it's a little bit like, if you could imagine, like a t-shirt or something, and you look at the collar in the back and it says, this belongs to Yehudis, the daughter of Marvin, as kind of a comparison today, where a girl has a Hebrew name and her father has an English name. I myself, I go by my slave name, Henry, in public, I guess. But all of my kids have Hebrew names. So it's kind of a funny thing. And if you go back a couple of generations in my family, then everyone has Hebrew names again. So there's kind of this cycle of Hebrew and then more assimilationist than Hebrew and so on. But let's move on. Okay. So concluding with the first part of this lecture, the next big chapter is the introduction of Greek culture, known as Hellenism. Hellas is the Greek word for Greece. And it really starts with Alexander the Great. If you have a look at this map here, Alexander comes from Macedon, which is towards the top left of the map, and he embarks on this massive crusade in the 4th century before the Common Era that conquers the entire eastern half of the Mediterranean basin and then extends out through Mesopotamia and makes its way all the way over to Afghanistan and what will be today parts of Pakistan. And this area is suddenly included within one overarching culture, Greek culture, and this creates essentially a Hellenism that stretches over many boundaries that prior to this point had never experienced a significant contact with Greek culture. And it really makes a huge difference. In fact, the Jews loved it. The Jews just found Hellenism so fascinating. One may say that Western culture, meaning European culture and by extension American, North American culture, South American culture as well, really derives from the cultures that come from two cities. Athens, which is one of the most important Greek cities, and Jerusalem, of course. And this refers to the melding of Hellenistic culture or Greek culture with Jewish culture. The Greeks contributed philosophy, art, literature, science, a lot of the ways that we think about the world, the way that we understand beauty, for example, really are based on Greek norms. But on the other hand, the Jews contributed a lot of our religious knowledge, a lot of our morality from the concept or the worships a God that values justice and will punish the wicked and reward the one who does right and so on. And of course, the extensive idea of life after death, which really flows from the idea of karma onish or punishment and reward. But the difficulty is, and was especially for Hellenistic Jews, where to draw the line. I mean, it's all fine and good to have Greek science, Greek literature, Greek art, things like that. But when you get to Greek mythology, Greek gods, things like that, where do you say, stop here and no more culture, because then it affects our own culture? So in fact, this is one of the major fights that was battled by the Jews in the second and first centuries, but particularly in the Hashmonaim revolt of the 2nd century, where, as I'm sure you're familiar from your Hanukkah stories, that several Jews began to protest against other Jews who were so-called Mitnavim, or self-Greekers, those who make themselves Greek, and they felt that they were tossing away too much that was essential to Jewish tradition in open slavish emulation of Greek norms, which got to the point of even desecrating the temple with idols and things like that. A national revolt ensued, led by the Maccabees, and surprisingly, the Jews were victorious, and they succeeded in establishing a Jewish kingdom for a brief period of time, separating from Alexander's reign and creating an independent state. Now, by the time we get to the year zero, the Hashmonaim had unfortunately declined, and ultimately the Romans began to take over the region. By the year zero, the Romans were firmly in power, and now we're moving into the second part of today's lecture, which really has to do with Jewish sectarianism. I'd like to take kind of a quick cross-section at Jewish opinion about how to deal with the Roman reality, and we'll place that into the larger historical context. So, the first group that we should look are the so-called Sadducees, or in Hebrew, the Tzedukim, who took their name from Tzadok, who was one of the early Kohanim. So-called because they were associated quite profoundly with the temple and its rituals. The Romans, having taken over political power, essentially gave the temple to those people who would bow to their wishes. And as a result, the Sadducees gained power in exchange for ultimately capitulation to the Roman demands. The Romans would demand things which went far beyond really what was acceptable under traditional Jewish practice, because the Sadducees felt that the Romans were, invincible, and the only way to really preserve Jewish practice would be to simply go along with what they were thinking. Similarly, the Sadducees were highly Hellenized. They rejected core elements of what had become Jewish standard thought, for example, the oral Torah, life after death, things like that. And they were excoriated by other groups of Jews, as we shall see. Here's a piece of art from another religious tradition, and there's a Sadducee here known as Caiaphas, and you can see that he's portrayed even by another religious tradition, not necessarily in a complimentary light. So the first group are the Sadducees. Then we move on to the Pharisees. These are the so-called good guys. The term Pharisee in English derives from the Hebrew parushim, which means to separate, those who separate, lifrosh. And their strategy was to essentially separate from the political institutions of Jewish power. They believed in kind of a tactical retreat, meaning if they could not control the temple without giving in to Roman demands, it would be better if they retreated from the temple, if they abandoned the temple, but they retreated to a position where they could safely define the core elements of Judaism and ensure that their followers weren't towing the line. Things like tithes became very important. Attachment to scholars, study of the oral Torah, these things became prominent to the Jews. They are essentially the main progenitors of what we would call today rabbinic Judaism. The Pharisees were the rabbis, and most of the heroes that we have in the Jewish tradition derive from this group. The next group that's really important are the Zealots, and we're going to spend a lot more time talking about them next week when we look at the Roman Jewish War. But their strategy was one of attack, meaning they did not believe at all in capitulating to the Romans like the Sadducees. They also did not believe in a tactical retreat like the Pharisees. They believed that the only way to defend the Jewish polity would be to forcibly throw the Romans out of the country. An amazingly quixotic and fanciful kind of desire given the overwhelming power of the Romans, but emboldened by the example of the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, the Zealots felt that this was a viable alternative, and thus they were prepared to undertake it, even to the extent of fighting with other Jewish groups. We'll return to those groups. We'll return to the Zealots next week. Finally, you have the Essenes, which were one of several highly separatist Jewish groups whose strategy was radical retreat, meaning the end of time was near. The Messiah was about to arrive. By the way, a belief that cascaded through all of these Jewish groups in one way or another, and that the correct way to deal with the Roman threat was to totally distance themselves from everything and focus completely on spiritual activities. Many of these Essenes practiced rather bizarre antinomian behavior, not necessarily traditional in Jewish practice at all. They tended to live in caves like these in the Judean desert, where in 1952, a young Arab boy was looking for a lost sheep. He wandered into one of these caves and he found one of the most amazing treasure troves discovered in modern history, the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls. Called the Dead Sea because Qumran, where they were found, is very close to the Dead Sea. And if we look at those scrolls, like we go into one of these caves here, watch this really cool effect. Here we go into the cave. He found these clay pots, he opened them up, and he brought them to Jerusalem, and they were found to have all these amazing scrolls. examples of the entire Hebrew Bible and lots of other documents as well, which were collected by groups like the Essenes and sheltered away in these caves. So we know a lot about the tenor of Jewish life at the turn of the year zero through documents like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are now housed, by the way, in an architecturally amazing shrine in Israel and Jerusalem called the Shrine of the Book. You walk into this amazingly shaped device, which is supposed to be evocative of the original containers in which they're discovered. You find the various scrolls laid out for public view. So those are the major groups. Let's plot them on a Venn diagram very quickly so it's easy to remember. First of all, you have the Sadducees, whose goal was to capitulate. They said the only way that we can manage our relationship with the Romans is if we give in to them, and we essentially let them have what they want. They were opposed by the Zealots, who felt that we should be at war with the Romans, forcibly evict them from the land of Israel, and also at odds with the Essenes, who felt that, politics, nishmaruns, not for us. We're going to go live in caves and separate completely from society. The sweet spot, which really evoked elements of all of these groups in one form or another, were the Pharisees, whose primary strategy was one of tactical retreat, meaning a temporary and well-defined retreat in order to be able to maintain a much more defensible ideological boundary with the outside society. And those are the progenitors of Judaism today. Okay, so that's the second lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. And I look forward to speaking with you in person, virtually, and in the next lecture. Here we're going to speak about the beginning of the diaspora, specifically the results of the Roman-Jewish wars of the first and second centuries. What you're looking at right now is an amazing night photograph of Masada, where some of the rebels against Rome made their last stand, or rather a amazing photograph. It's a rite of passage for many Israelis, and in fact many diaspora Jews, climb Masada. I know I myself, when I was about 18 years old, I went with a kibbutz that I was staying on, and we climbed it by candlelight in the pre-dawn hours and stood on the top watching the sunrise over Moab. For a long time, especially in my generation, the slogan was "Masada will never fall again." So against this backdrop, let's have a look at the beginning of the diaspora and the disastrous Roman wars. So to start with, we should think a little bit about our sources. How do we know about this period? First of all, we have some Jewish sources on it, primarily in the Midrash and the Talmud, documents which we'll discuss more extensively later on in the course. There are some difficulties with using these two texts, however. First of all, they're not intended as historical texts. And secondly, they're often composed decades or even centuries after the events that they describe. Similar to the problem with using the Bible as a historical source, there's a lot of valuable material, particularly for the spiritual and philosophical approach to the debacle of the Roman-Jewish wars, but it can be problematic as a strictly historical source. Also problematic as a strictly historical source, but nevertheless much more fulfilling, is the work of Flavius Josephus, shown here. Not necessarily the way he looked, but, kind of an interesting looking picture. I doubt he wore a turban quite like that, but nevertheless, let's move on. Josephus was a Jewish leader who was ultimately pressed into Roman service, and he worked directly for the Roman governors, and in fact was well acquainted with the Roman Emperor Vespasian, and especially his son Titus. We know quite a bit about him because he left a large corpus of literature, including a book called The Jewish War, which treats specifically the War of the First Century, also an autobiography, and also a massive work called Jewish Antiquities, which was a much larger discussion of Judaism as a whole and its history. He wrote in both Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the age, and he also wrote in Greek. Unfortunately, the Aramaic version, which may have shed different light on what he had to say to Jews from a Jew to other Jews, is lost. We only have the Greek version, which was written for the victors, written for the Romans in particular, so we have many questions about really what his attitude was. Some historians will view him as a kind of a Jewish traitor for having gone over to the Roman side. Others will say that he was a victim of circumstance. He chose the most viable option possible in those times. We'll set that debate aside for another lecture, but nevertheless, he left an extremely detailed account, if slightly tendentious, that gives a lot of information about the period in general. Looking at the political context, we should recall that this is an era of increasing Jewish sectarianism. We spoke about it a little bit last week, but these divisions between Jews were even sharper and more fractured during the period. We have not yet touched on the growth of early Jewish Christianity. That will be the topic of next week's lecture, but that was also an increasingly difficult element in the stew that was Judaism and the Jewish people at the turn of the first century. There's also a lot of messianic circulating, something that really affects all of the movements, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, just as much as the Essenes and the early Jewish Christians. And in fact, one of the elements that was very important in the revolutionary movement was which Jewish leader would in fact be the Messiah, the Redeemer of the Jews. Another element of the political context is the gradual, incremental extension of Roman rule over the province, an erosion of Jewish privileges, and an extension of Roman demands on the Jewish people. And sometimes these things descended to tiny degrees of significance that were nevertheless extremely important to the population as a whole. For example, there was a question over whether or not a Roman leader could build a house that overlooked the temple courtyard itself, which presents in Jewish law some difficulties because it would have been physically higher than the temple itself, but it also afforded less privacy to the priests and the Levites who were performing the various sacrificial acts. So in retaliation for the building of this palace, the priesthood had a wall built that would extend up over the temple courtyard and prevent vision of what was happening actually in the temple courtyard. And there was considerable violence exerted over this one small construction. And this is just one example of the kind of increasing level of friction that was experienced by the Romans and the Jews at this time. The Zealots were perhaps the most active and corrosive element in the Jewish mix at this time. The Zealots were a loosely defined group of discontents, far more extensive than they had been in the Hellenistic period, and they were also known for their proclivity to violence. They were ready to attack Romans and other Jews with the drop of a hat. Ironically, they had the support of the Idumeans, who were Jews who were forcibly converted several centuries earlier, many of whom were regarded as not Jewish by many of the Pharisaic elements of society, and they turned out to be the most powerful Jewish nationalists of them all, really very aggressive in their defense of their conception of Jewish political autonomy. The massacres went on between the Zealots and the more moderate groups, sometimes in the hundreds and thousands, and they also massacred each other as they competed for the title of the Messiah, because this is something that we heard about really quite a bit of energy, the feeling that one of these leaders would ultimately emerge as the political and military redeemer of the Jewish people. Community, there's a very fascinating famous passage in the Talmud in which the moderate Pharisaic Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wanted to achieve a form of a compromise with the Romans who were besieging the region, and there was no way that the zealots who were behind the fortifications would allow him to go out and speak with the Romans. So he faked his own death, and his students asked permission to carry his body out in a coffin for burial. He, meanwhile, was alive inside the coffin, and the zealots, suspecting that something was amiss, they used iron poles and shot through the top of the coffin, hoping to make sure that Yochanan ben Zakkai was in fact dead. He amazingly survived this ordeal, and once he was outside of the limits of fortifications, he was able to conduct his negotiations with the Romans. But this gives you a sense of the very difficult relationship between the more moderate Pharisees and the zealots. So the first Roman-Jewish war was precipitated when Eliezer, who was previously a Sadducee, became a zealot, and because he was in control of much of the temple ritual at the time, he prohibited the acceptance of sacrifices from foreigners. This was in the month of August in the year 66. And prior to this, non-Jews could easily bring sacrifices to the temple, which was, allowing them to participate in the overall cultic aspects of Jewish worship. And it was very customary that a certain number of sacrifices would be offered in honor of the Romans by Romans. So by rejecting these sacrifices, essentially a slap in the face to the Roman authorities, saying that they could no longer continue participating in the temple ritual. And so Agrippa, Jewish representative of the Romans, sent troops out to force Eliezer to receive these sacrifices as he had previously. Eliezer counterattacked by burning down Agrippa's palace, and in an indication of the socioeconomic elements of this revolt, he also burned down the House of Records, which held all of the records of debts, especially mortgages, because there were many impoverished Jews who felt that they were being aggrieved economically, and by destroying those mortgages, that meant that they would have more freedom to pay their debts. Now, at the same time, a contender for the leadership of the Jewish people, a approved military commander named Menachem, someone who had already attacked successfully the Romans at Masada, entered Jerusalem, seeing that a rebellion was beginning. He immediately sought to vanquish his rival by murdering his father and his uncle, and Eliezer, in turn, managed to capture Menachem, tortured him until he was dead as well. So this is just an illustration of the kind of infighting that was going on between the Jews, and in fact, the story would get much worse. Eliezer came treacherously towards the Romans, promising, for example, that soldiers would be spared if they would surrender, and then breaking his word and slaughtering them. On occasion, some were spared if they were to undergo circumcision, but otherwise Eliezer conducted himself really in a thoroughly dishonorable manner. But this was certain to evoke the ire of the Romans. So let's see how the Romans responded. It's not surprising, really. As the news of the revolt spread through the ancient world, there were violence directed at Jews everywhere else. In Crete, in Syria, wherever there was a significant Roman community or Greek community, there was violence against Jews. Jews were typically minorities in these regions and were largely affluent. Rome decided to counterattack by sending reinforcements down from Syria. They were not, however, quite successful. Jewish guerrilla forces were able to harass them on the way and ultimately stop them before they reached Jerusalem. And so for a very brief period of time, Jews managed to hold on, otherwise overwhelming Roman might, and maintain their independence. But this was short-lived. The Emperor Nero appointed Vespasian, their plus on the top here, and unlike the picture of Flavius Josephus, these are probably much more accurate reproductions of what they look like. He appointed the general Vespasian to handle the Jewish revolt. And this was, by the way, the context in which Josephus came into Vespasian's circle. Josephus, surrounded by Vespasian's troops, uh, designed a suicide pact with all of his fellow Jewish soldiers. By drawing short straws, he managed to somehow make sure that he was one of the last ones left to survive, and all the other Jews killed themselves. At which point, he turned himself over to Vespasian, and he was taken captive. Vespasian took a liking to this intelligent young Jewish man, and his son Titus befriended him, and this is how Josephus began his climb to authority. The Jews, meanwhile, were basically free to do what they wanted for about 3 years early on in the war, as Vespasian realized that they were, destroying themselves quite effectively, and so he allowed these zealots to essentially expend their own energies murdering each other, and he kept his forces quite safe, waiting for the time when he would be able to enter Jerusalem. He was also quite active in overall empire affairs, as he was ultimately appointed the emperor to succeed Nero, and he handed over the operation to his son. Ultimately, Titus was able to enter Jerusalem, and in August 70, he was able to destroy Jerusalem and especially the temple. The destruction of the temple is, of course, commemorated every year by Jews on the 9th of Tisha B'Av, which is traditionally understood as the day of the destruction of both temples, as well as the fall of Beitar, which will be later on in the second. At this point, the Romans took their revenge in a very significant manner. Titus slaughtered resistors left and right. Anyone over the age of 17 was captured and exiled, and many were simply set aside for the famous bread and circuses, the gladiatorial games that were so important to the Romans. 2,500 of them were killed for Titus' brother's birthday party alone, fed to lions and chained before armed gladiators and so on. Josephus' estimate is that about 1.1 million Jews were killed in this first Roman-Jewish war. Probably an exaggeration, but Tacitus, a Roman historian, gives us a more reasonable figure that says that the normal population of the city of Jerusalem was about 120,000 at the time, quite a large city. And because of the fighting countryside, it may have swollen to about 600,000. So you can imagine that within this context, large refugee population in the town, it would be incredible devastation. And there's no doubt whatsoever that the numbers were absolutely atrocious and the Jews suffered heavily. After achieved his victory, which was a foregone conclusion because the Roman Empire was really so much more massive, the Romans were far more expert in their military skills. He went on to construct a whole series of ceremonial arches, points, and other elements that celebrated the Jews. Let's have a look at this point here, which you see on the right says, Dea Capta, Israel is captured, Israel is taken, and you see this seated woman with her head on her hands that represents the sad in Jerusalem, and the Roman authority looks on with some pleasure and authority, and on the left you see a figure of a Roman authority as well. Down here you see a large view of the Arch that stands in Rome that celebrates the victory over the Jews. There's a view from underneath, you get a sense of how powerful it is. And if you look on the right-hand side, a very important element that's really quite famous in art history. This is a slightly different colored version of it that shows the Romans carrying the off, and the spoils of war include the menorah, although there's some dispute over that in Jewish sources. And generally, this is a depiction of the Jews' subjugation to the Romans at the end of the First Roman-Jewish War. The last stand, however, was at Masada, which was this massive rock formation just north of the Dead Sea. You can see it there in the upper left photograph. And Eliezer, his followers, held out there for 3 years. They were able ultimately to withstand a very punishing Roman siege, but in the end, they all succumbed a mass suicide pact, something like the version that Josephus describes in his own life, uh, which they all took lots and decided to massacre each other, the Romans rescuing only a handful of survivors. Here's a beautiful view of the archaeological dig. You can see on the bottom there are some palaces there that were constructed by previous emperors, and on the top are the fortifications where the Jews made their last stand. You can see the forbidding landscape of the Judean hills in the background. Here are some of the structures that still remain. Believed to be some kind of synagogue area, and here you can see there's some dwellings, some living quarters, and so on. And there's even some caves. They have even had some weapons or fortifications, and what is believed to be a mikvah or a ritual bath, very important element in the self-purification rituals of traditional Judaism, which may have been practiced to a greater degree by these zealots. It's especially fascinating because they would have a mikvah at the very top of Masada, incredibly dry environment. It's actually the lowest point on the face of the earth, next door. The devastation after the revolt was phenomenal. The Romans followed a scorched earth policy that destroyed much of the arable land in the region, which they seized anyways, and they declared it all part of the state. The Romans then resold or rented the land to its former owners or to the highest bidder. They destroyed half of the buildings in Jerusalem, and the population was reduced by at least 2/3. Finally, as the last insult, the so-called fiscus judaicus, the Jewish tax, which was previously imposed to support the temple. All Jews had to support the temple by paying this tax. It was remained in place. It was held in place even though the temple was destroyed. But instead, the funds were directed to the temple of Capitoline Jupiter, which was in Rome. In other words, the money that Jews used to celebrate their central religious structure and institution was now directed to the upkeep of pagan idol worship in Rome. The tax was also extended to women and all age groups, which was something that was not part of the original Fiscus Judaicus. And this was really a very clear symbolic gesture that Judaism and the Jewish people were now completely under control of the Romans. A few decades later, we have a short reprise of the Jewish-Roman War in the Second War, sometimes called the Bar Kokhba Revolt. Emperor Hadrian, who in other ways was often considered more of a liberal figure, he imposed several draconian bans which were directed at larger populations but were felt especially hard by the Jews, and there's no question that Hadrian was aware of the impact it would have on Jews. For example, his ban on circumcision affected the Phoenicians, Egyptians, and others, but the Jews were the ones who were the most fervent about attaching themselves to the ancient ritual, and by banning circumcision, this was a direct attack on their national religion. Hadrian attempted to settle large numbers of Romans in Israel to dilute the remaining Jewish character of the region, and he in fact renamed Jerusalem Aila Capitolina, which is a reference to both Hadrian's family, he was one of the Aili, and also the previously mentioned temple of Zeus or of Jupiter in Rome. There's some debate on the chronology of these elements, whether or not these were the cause of the revolt, or the revolt was the cause of them, specifically the renaming of Jerusalem. But there's no doubt that the imposition of policies like this sparked a major revolt, which broke out in the year 132. Here you can see a coin that Hadrian minted at the time, and the reference here is to Judea, but on the right there are several references here, the woman with the begging bowl, or with the sacrificial bowl, and with the 3 children. No reference whatsoever to the Jewish character, more references really to the pagan character of the Roman imposition on Israel. So the Second Roman-Jewish War broke out in 132. The Jews had been preparing for it for more than a decade. Jewish workmen, for example, were known to prepare poor weapons for the Romans, and when they were given over as per their demands, the Romans found them unworthy and returned them. So the Jews were able to arm themselves to some degree and prevent the Romans from having an extensive amount of arms. They may have also prepared some subterranean tunnels that allowed them to hide out Romans, but ultimately there was no way that they could succeed in their attempt to throw off the massive Roman Empire. They were led by a ferocious, talented military leader, Shimon Bar Kokhba, known as Bar Kokhba, the son of a star, and his popularity was bolstered by the fact that none other than the older Rabbi Akiva, one of the leading Pharisaic figures of the period, actually believed that Bar Kokhba was in fact Mashiach, the Messiah. Others disagreed. Rabbi Yochanan of the time said to Rabbi Akiva that grass will grow on your cheeks and the Messiah will not have come. But nevertheless, Akiva's support of Bar Kokhba certainly added to his authority and popularity. The early rebels of this time managed to take Jerusalem early and construct more defenses and so on, but ultimately there was no way for them to succeed. Their last stand was at Beitar, which was destroyed in August 135. It's believed that it occurred on the same day, Tisha B'Av, as the destruction of the two temples. This is in many ways known as, in a somewhat flippant way, National Jewish Mint, minted by the Bar Kokhba forces. They were fond of taking Roman coins and then simply melting them and printing their own designs on top of them. This not only was less expensive because the coins were already prepared, it also took Roman coins out of circulation. And finally, there was a certain level of satisfaction in the symbolic value of stamping out the Roman presence and in putting on a Jewish presence. There's frequently in Bar Kokhba's coins from the period lots of religious metaphors, symbols such as the lulav and so on. You can see on the left here a reference to the temple. So there's no question that the Bar Kokhba revolt was very closely tied to religious values of the era. When the revolution was put down, it was put down with great ferocity and violence. This is the period of the so-called Asara Malchus, the 10 martyrs of the state. 10 rabbis, including the famous Rabbi Akiva, were captured, were horribly tortured and murdered by Hadrian at the time. Rabbi Akiva's death, of course, along with several others, memorialized the poor service as he played alive. He says to students how all his life he wanted to be able to fulfill the requisite commandment of the Shema, saying, love your Lord your God with all your soul, and even by giving up his soul. Jews were banned from entering Jerusalem, and in fact even banned from being within eyeshot of Jerusalem. The entire Judean region was empty of Jews. Major population shift occurred to the Galilee region, the Galilee, where there was Jewish life continuing, and the exile, which was quite clear, really, in the first century, was now absolutely confirmed. But there's a famous story that's worth mentioning in conclusion here. At one point, Rabbi Akiva was walking through the ruins of the temple with his colleagues, and they saw a fox running through the ruins. The other rabbis began to cry, and Rabbi Akiva began to laugh. So the other rabbi said, Rabbi, why are you laughing? This is terrible. Foxes are running loose through the temple. And Rabbi Akiva quoted a prophecy that says that this would in fact happen in order to bring about the redemption. And he says that since we know that Jerusalem is destroyed, we also know, therefore, that the redemption will one day come. Okay, thank you for listening to this lecture, and I look forward to speaking to you next week when we're talking about early Jewish Christianity. Welcome to this series, Origin of Christianity. let's go straight to the material and discuss this fascinating topic. So, first of all, let's look at the background image, which is a reproduction called Strasbourg's representation on the outside of a major cathedral in Strasbourg that shows the church contrasted with the synagogue. And obviously, a medieval depiction actually is a modern reproduction of a medieval depiction, but it's a theme that was extremely important to this topic and will become even more important when we look at the medieval period. Basically, on the left, ecclesia, church, and she's always portrayed many hundreds of examples we have of this sort of thing as an upright, crowned figure. Her staff is unbroken. She holds the chalice, the grail. Her gaze is steady, and her clothes are properly arranged, and so on. And she's looking with perhaps some disdain at the fallen synagogue. You see that her head is uncovered, representing a loss of modesty. Her staff is broken, representing a loss of power, loss of physical power as a state. She is blindfolded, indicating that she's blinded to the truth of Christianity. And falling from her left hand are representations of tablets of the law, indicating that she's full of religion. Her whole posture is one of decline. She's falling. The original, which I don't have unfortunately to show you right now, but she's actually falling away from the rock. And the overall message that this couple portrays is that the synagogue has lost its authority and the church has replaced it. We'll return to that topic in just a minute. And the medieval period of this course, we'll look at many more examples of ecclesia and synagoga, which have a lot of different variations as well. The idea is that according to the early Christians, really into the second century of Christianity, this idea becomes very prominent that God has abandoned the Jews and has transferred his favor on the church. Okay, let's have a look at the material of the course. First of all, what are our sources for this period? One of the most rich treasure trove sources for the study of early Christianity is, of course, the corpus of early Christian literature, which includes the New Testament, the so-called addendum to the Hebrew Scriptures, now called the Old Testament, which describe the life of Jesus and the life of his followers and their teachings. In particular, are the four first books known as the Gospels, which are purportedly written by people who knew Jesus personally. And this is not the place to get into more extensive literary criticism, but it's unlikely that the texts as we have them today were really written during Jesus' lifetime by his followers, although there may be some core elements which were faithfully handed down in an oral tradition and then later transcribed. So these four Gospels have an incredibly important thing to say about Jesus within the context of early Judaism and early Christianity. They differ on some details, and that's the basis for a large engine of scholarly research. Again, someplace that we're not going to go today. But nevertheless, the Gospels are perhaps our most important source for this period. We also have an extremely important resource in the Talmud, which records, again, many oral traditions that were written later. Like the Christian sources, the Talmud is somewhat deficient, of course, because it's highly tendentious. I mean, the Christian sources obviously want to magnify the role, importance, and divinity of Jesus, whereas the Talmud wishes to contract that authority and that respect. And we'll look towards the end of today's class at a couple of examples of that. So the Talmud also written much later than the Gospels. Many of the versions that we have today date from the 3rd through the 5th century, hundreds of years after the life of Jesus, although again they may be relating some oral transmissions. We also have some interesting references, not necessarily directly to Christianity, but nevertheless to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, by looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls that we discussed in this chapter. Finally, scattered and tantalizing references in Roman sources such as
What's up, Dave? Did you watch my interview yet?
not been coined, and the early Christians were all Jew, at a certain level, but those are our major sources for discussion. So let's go over his life story very briefly.
Dave Smith, go into the chat and get the link.
Get by passing by monuments around the number, but basically that was something of a Pharisee. There's no question that Jesus himself was meshed Pharisaic. Most of his most significant discussion, theological disputes, are with Pharisees or concerning Pharisaic doctrine. So he definitely was part of that larger group of thinkers. He frequently quotes early Mishnaic figures, such as Hillel in particular, and his most acerbic comments are directed, at least in the versions of the Gospel that we have, towards Pharisees, not because he is furthest away from them, quite the opposite, it's because he is close to them. For example, if you think of your own families, if you have siblings, you're more likely to observe your more cutting and caustic remarks for your siblings, not because they're distant. You wouldn't say such things, for example, to someone you just met on a bus, but you say them to your sibling because you love your sibling and you can say what you think, for good or for ill, and you know they will forgive you. So much of Jesus' dialogue with the rabbis should be understood within this context. They were having very heated, passionate disagreements over the nature of God, God's role for humanity, the requirements of one human being to another, but nevertheless, it was like really an inter-family or intra-family dispute, and not something that was much more distinct. His principal teaching really can be derived heavily from the teaching of Hillel, although there were some significant modifications. For example, Hillel's teaching of the so-called golden rule, as is known from Jesus' time, is placed in the negative. When asked in a famous passage in Tractate Shabbat, can you teach me the entire Torah standing on one foot? Hillel responds, that which is hateful unto you, do not do your neighbor. That is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. And he adds, go and study. Jesus puts it in the positive that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If this were a theology or philosophy class, we would engage in discussion perhaps in a larger context, but right now that gives an example of the relationship between Hillel and in many cases Jesus quotes Hillel directly, often without attribution in the Gospels, but some scholars can work through literary archaeology and find it. His principal teachings were very populist. One of the criticisms that he had to endure was the fact that he reached out to all classes of society, the dispossessed, the discarded, the sometimes ritually unfit, and he was really, as far as we can tell from our sources, an extremely popular preacher who was not afraid to take on authority. Relationship with other groups was caustic. He was not a fan of the Sadducees whatsoever, and his disruption of the activities at the temple was definitely seen as an open incitement to rebellion against the Romans, who were, of course, the primary patrons of the Sadducees. He also was not fond of the extreme violence associated with the zealots. In fact, the overall tenor of speech was much more passive. Ultimately, however, this comes down to the end of his life, which is an extremely important topic that we will certainly return to in the medieval period, the passion of Jesus, which refers to his crucifixion, death, and according to the Christians, his resurrection 3 days later. The basic version of the story, just reading the Gospel without any further kind of layering of meaning, is that he was betrayed by his disciple to the Romans. The Sadducees, in particular the high priest, were interested in removing this irritant from their larger society. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, again from the Gospel, apparently quite enamored with Jesus as an individual and perhaps even believing in his messianic identity, offers to the Jews on the eve of Passover, immediately after, by the way, or actually maybe the day of Passover, at the Last Supper, and that's supposed to be the Passover Seder. Not sure. Fact check the instructor here, send in a comment. But at any rate, Pontius Pilate offers the Jews, and we have no other historical basis for this custom, but he offers the assembled Jews in the courtyard of the temple the opportunity to have one prisoner released. He offers them the choice of Jesus, one they call the Messiah, or Barabbas, a common thief. The assembled Jews from the version of the Gospel say, well, we want Barabbas, we don't want Jesus. Pontius Pilate essentially says, are you sure this is rather special, and so on? They know, and a very famous passage recorded in the book of Matthew, reverberate with great significance down the centuries. The Jews assembled there say, his blood be upon us and upon our children. For scholars today, that's understood as being a kind of retro reference to the destruction of the temple that happened several decades later. In other words, it was a figure of the destruction of the temple. So those Jews who specifically, allegedly condemned Jesus will lay bare their decision in seeing the temple destroyed. But throughout the ages, medieval commentators and particularly lay practitioners have understood this as a millennial acceptance by Jews for the responsibility of Jesus. Meaning, your average Jew in the 13th, 15th, 21st century somehow has the blood of Jesus on his hands because the Jews back then said, his blood be upon us and upon our children. This is probably a gross distortion of the original meaning of the author, but even more importantly, it's a gross distortion of Christian theology. Not something that I consider myself an expert in, but it's a pretty basic idea that Jesus died, Christian thought, for our sins. Therefore, everyone has share in the guilt of the death of the one they call the Messiah. And so, therefore, to shunt all that blame onto the Jews seems very much against the basic tenor of Jesus. At any rate, from this point on, the Romans take over. The Romans are the ones who crucify him. He dies a horrible death, and his followers later claim that he was revived from the dead and will one day come again. That's your Christianity 101 for those of you who are taking this from a Jewish background. Of course, in the medieval telling of this story, the Jews have a much larger role in it, actively torturing Jesus as he makes his way to the site of the crucifixion and so on. But that's not anywhere recorded in the Gospels, which are really quite terse and very clear on who's responsible for the death of Jesus. Amazingly, Christianity grows from this tiny sect of Jews with a tiny following in this tiny region of the Roman Empire. And within 300 years, it actually ends up being accepted as the official religion of the entire Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine, shown here in this bust, is the one who makes this official in the early 4th century. And it is one of the great success stories of a religious movement to see how Christianity moved from such a tiny kernel of an idea to something that encompassed the entire civilized Western world as well. It's also especially ironic because relations between the early Christians and Jews, and even more so Romans, were terrible. The Christians were persecuted bitterly by the Romans. They were a favored choice of victim for the gladiatorial game. And the relationship with Jews, which we'll explore in a second, was also quite fractious. But the key element in the success of Christianity was essentially the movement from this intra-Jewish sect to Gentile religion. Gentile, of course, means non-Jewish. Once Christianity could be exported, its idea, fundamental concept, could be exported to a larger non-Jewish audience, and the specifics of Jewish practice that were found so difficult by many non-Jews, including, for example, circumcision, the dietary laws, the mandatory Sabbath laws, which are hard for me to understand because Shabbos is At any rate, these kinds of restrictions were seen as so negative by Gentiles. There's just no way that Judaism fell on a really big scale. Although I hope towards the end of this unit, not today, but maybe a little later, talk about the. Well, let's just skip it. I like doing these things in one kind of way. At any rate, once they could transport basic Jewish ideas through Jesus' teachings, like the idea of a personal God, the idea of life after death, the idea of prayer, beautiful ethical instructions, love your neighbor as yourself, things like that. Once that could be exported to a Gentile audience without the ritual and customary restrictions of Judaism, then all of a sudden it explode. And that's exactly what happened. At the same time, this transformation of Christianity from a tiny Jewish group to a larger Gentile movement had some repercussions, which we will now turn to. The way in which this really happened was through the activity of Paul of Tarsus, one of Jesus' primary exponents. Saint Paul, celebrated in the Christian Bible after the Gospels in particular. He wrote quite a few of the Gospels. And he essentially took Christianity on the road throughout the Roman Empire, especially in Asia Minor, in Syria. He was getting out there and discussing what Jesus stood for. He himself was locked in a conflict with other earlier followers of Jesus, many of whom felt that was intended really for Jews. It was kind of like Judaism plus, that Jews were supposed to observe the Jews were supposed to observe all of the commandments of Judaism, plus believe in Jesus as the Messiah and adopt his ethical teaching on top of the onerous burden, the Olach Shemayim, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, that represents the 613 commandments of Judaism. So Paul was the one who eventually defeated this opinion to say, no, Jesus' ministry really means something for the entire world, and followers of Jesus need not adopt more than a few practices, such as, for example, baptism. But Paul had several challenges, one of which was, for example, what do you do with the Hebrew scriptures? The foundation of Judaism was in the Tanakh, and it was widely respected throughout the ancient world. Romans, they respected the fact that Judaism clearly had antiquity, of great age and importance, and they could point to this document that had withstood the test of time for centuries, and it testified to their validity. Now, one of the things that's really so important in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is this repeated emphasis of the chosen, a difficult theological concept that we'll have to wrestle with all the way through their history, but it's very difficult to get away from passages such as the Am Segula, the treasured people, the Mamlechet Kohanim, the kingdom of priests, the B'ni Bechori Israel, my child, my firstborn Israel. Very clear from the Hebrew scriptures that God has something special in mind for the Jews. It's not totally clear from those texts that God says they are somehow better. That is, again, not for a history lecture, or for a hashkafa or philosophy, theology. But there's no question that Jews are chosen for something. So when Paul is going throughout the Mediterranean basin talking about Christianity, one of the key questions is, well, how does this relate to Judaism? You know, the Jews are generally not accepting what you're saying, so what are you adding? What is different? So Paul essentially articulates a replacement theory, sometimes called the Pauline doctrine, which he says that all of that is true. Everything in the Hebrew scriptures is absolutely valid. The problem is that the Jews didn't give up their end of the bargain. Meaning, God makes all these promises to the Jews, he gives all kinds of value to the Jews, and they worship idols, they transgress ethical teachings, and as a result, God, as it were, transfers his favor from the Jews to now the Gentiles who follow Jesus, aka Christianity. And this is a really important point that we saw in that overall image that I started the class with, ecclesia and synagoga, the church versus the synagogue, that expresses in non-literary terms, very, very important for an illiterate audience of peasants, educated in the ideas of Christianity. It articulates the Pauline doctrine that, true, Judaism was really special at one point, but now Christianity is really special. That way, they can go back and read the Old Testament and even read Jesus' life into it through so-called prefigurements, where there are lots of references, for example, in Isaiah, to a character that later could be applied to the life of Jesus. For Christians, of course, these are theological non-negotiables. For Jews, they represent a distortion of the meaning of the text. But again, this is a history class, so we're not going to go into it. As Christianity develops further away from Judaism, specifically as it becomes ethnically less Jewish and more Gentile, the nature of the Christian-Jewish dialogue changes as well. There used to be this internal argument, this family discussion over who's right and who's wrong, but it morphs into us versus them kind of discussion. The Jews are clearly the them, they are the outsiders, and this represents a greater rift between these two groups, Jews and Christians. Now, Jews were not completely uninvolved with this entire process, and we see a very strong Jewish counter-reaction to this growing gentilization of Christianity. And at some point, probably in the late first century or early second century, the Jews reach a rather strong decision to formally break with the teachings of Jesus. There was no such earlier discussion to do so, but as they saw the movement changing and adopting, a more lenient attitude towards the mitzvot, towards the commandments, then the rabbis decided it was time to make a clear distinction. Let me just make one small point that I think is very important here. Judaism, traditional Judaism is often called orthodox, which means one doctrine, one set of ideas. And that is a little bit of a distortion of what traditional Judaism is. The term, in fact, by the way, was coined by liberal Reform Jews in the 19th century, and it was a term of opprobrium, meant to make fun of Orthodox Jews, so to speak. But in reality, traditional Judaism is not so much orthodox, one doctrine, as it is orthopractic, one set of practices. There's this idea that there's only a handful of commandments which deal with how Jews should think. Obviously, there are many teachings and ethical exhortations to think in a certain way, but really, in terms of commandments, it's really where the rubber meets the road. How can you make a chicken kosher? Are these people allowed to be married? Those are the kinds of decisions that occupy most Jewish discourse throughout their literature. Judaism, traditional Judaism, is probably better thought of as orthopractic, meaning one practice. Even that is a bit of an exaggeration because you have various takes on how to behave, Sephardic, Ashkenazic, Machmir, Makil. We won't go into those. But Christianity was basically fine in the Jewish context until it began to challenge practice, to admit people to the fold who did not observe the traditional laws. And that's when Judaism and Christianity really began to split from the Jewish perspective. There's a fantastic incident with Rabbi Rothschild ben Prachi that I would really like to discuss, but I won't be able to keep this lecture under 30 minutes if I do so. I'm going to skip ahead to number 2. And this is a passage that occurs that's described in the Tractate Brachot, where the rabbis decide to add a new blessing to the Shemona Esrei. They decide to add a new blessing to the central prayer of Judaism, which essentially draws that line in the sand by placing a blessing on the heretic. So to speak, blessing here is euphemistically a curse. And the text of that blessing basically says, anybody who informs against us, and they're thinking here about informing the Romans, for example, and deeper thinking and supported by some literary archaeological evidence of anyone who is really a Christian, is outside of the fold. And this particular blessing, which would have to be read publicly by the prayer leader, was a way of identifying those Jews who were Christians. by challenging a person to lead the prayers, obviously a male, to lead the prayers, the person had this difficult choice of either pronouncing this blessing, which would eventually bring down a curse upon himself, or he could omit the blessing, in which he would be exposed as a Christian and then be ejected from the synagogue. There are some scholars who believe that St. John, the author of one of the Gospels, was so expelled from his community, and this may be the reason why his Gospel in particular tends to have especially vituperative language directed. Nevertheless, even though the separation between Jews and Christians really widens when you get into the 2nd century, Jews and Christians are still cross-fertilizing each other to a tremendous degree. So much so that many of the church fathers, such as St. John Chrysostom, have to specifically warn Christians, stay away from the Jews. We don't practice Jewish habits. We don't do these kinds of things. You don't have to be kosher to be Christian, etc. For several centuries. Many of those things are formalized in the Council of Nicaea, for example, which determined that Christianity would not follow the Jewish calendar, that Easter, although associated with Passover, would no longer be so, which is why these holidays are really very close together in the Gregorian calendar we follow today, but they are on different days. So, one last point before I make my 30-minute mark. There's an extensive scholarly debate on the origins of anti-Semitism that reflects on the topic. By the way, the image here is another example of Ecclesia and Synagoga. I couldn't find a colorized version, but it's also very beautiful. You see the same motifs of the broken staff, the downcast gaze. You don't see the blindfold, you don't see the tablets dropping, but there will be some variation. The theme, nevertheless, repeats many times. So among scholars, there's a great debate as to when does anti-Semitism actually develop. One school of thought is that it goes way, way back, perhaps the biblical Esau. And we certainly see some support for this in the extensive references to non-Jews, extensive references to Jews, which are pretty much universally uncomplimentary in the Greek and Roman sources. But on the other hand, there is another argument to be made, which we'll have to follow up with in a later lecture, that says that is something special about the relationship between the nascent Christian movement separating itself from the mother religion that adds a dynamic of criticism that is much more caustic and ultimately long-lasting in its implications. So again, I'm running out of time. I want to keep these under 30 minutes. We'll have to return to this later lecture, but I found it useful. Thank you very much for listening. Hello, everyone. Well, we've got a great topic. We're going to look at the Talmud, a topic that really is fascinating for me. It's something that I spent a lot of time studying and something that I continue to get a lot of energy out of. It's an extremely important text in Judaism. It's been called the Constitution of Judaism because of its very centrality to Jewish life and thought. And let's have a look at what exactly is involved with the Talmud. So what we're looking at right here is the frontispiece or the title page of a very famous edition of the Talmud that published by widow and brothers Rom from Vilna. This is the typical title page from a so-called Vilna Shas. Not exactly what that term means. As you can see from the bottom there, this one was published in 1881. The edition comes really from the 1860s, and it's one of the most important editions of Talmud that's ever been published. Moving along in the text of the Talmud. Oh, by the way, I kind of like doing this because I always felt such a warm feeling when I looked at this particular page with the portico, the gates going into the Talmud. It always felt so fascinating and exotic. And okay, here we go. So, to begin with, I'll tell you a very quick story about something that happened to me when I was studying in yeshiva, which is, of course, a center for adult study of the Torah, and was studying in a place called Or Sameach in Jerusalem. And one, they had this problem where they had a lot of students who would come to yeshiva, especially those who came from the collapsed Soviet Union, where there was a certain amount of trepidation that perhaps yeshiva would close, perhaps something would go wrong with yeshiva, and people would afterwards they would get a second portion, and they would take it up to the dormitory room. And the problem was that it cost a lot of money for the yeshiva, and it also attracted bugs, kinds of things like that. So the yeshiva decided to make a new policy that they posted outside the yeshiva door, outside the cafeteria door. The policy read like this: the yeshiva provides food for one portion only. No student is permitted to stand in line for a second portion. Now, what the administration of the yeshiva had probably not counted on is the fact that these are young men who spend their entire day focusing on textual questions and on analyzing possible meaning of an ambiguous text. And so when I came out of lunch that particular day, I happened to glance back and I saw the sign, and I saw that someone had subtly altered it, little emendations. So it read like this: yeshiva provides food for one portion only. No, is permitted to stand in line for a second portion. This is an illustration of the kind of skills that are developed through studying the Talmud. Very, very sensitive analysis of the text, of what is possible with the text, and really a phenomenal mental exercise and spiritual exercise that has been the primary intellectual occupation for the Jews in the diaspora for about 1,500 years. So I'm going to take a lot of stuff from a book I wrote a couple of years ago, a small book that is a brief and personal introduction, something they call the Speak of Talmud, that talks a little bit about my personal encounter with the Talmud. It has a lot of kind of like fun stories like that in it, I think, and a lot more material which really talks about what exactly is the Talmud. By the way, this photograph here, things. First of all, it's not photoshopped. That is an actual photograph of me wearing a black suit going into the Atlantic Ocean. A friend of mine, Stephen Mills, took this great photo, and it was, I have to say, I had a lot of explaining to do when I got home because my wife was a little bit perturbed with what I had done. Luckily, however, the cleaners, and I thank them in the book, the dry cleaners did a good job with the suit. They cleaned it perfectly well. I was able to wear it again, of course. And the funniest part is that the sand got into the hem of the cuffs of the pants. They had to actually unssew all of the cuffs, get the sand out, and clean it again. Second thing I should tell you is that I'm holding a Talmud volume there. We were very careful that no Talmud volumes were harmed during this photo shoot at all. Of course, that would be disrespectful, and we took good care of them. At any rate, on my website there is a short excerpt from this text that basically talks about what I'm going to say today. If you'd like to read the whole thing, of course, that would be great. So what exactly is the Talmud? First of all, an extended commentary on the Mishnah. I refer you back to the lecture where we talked about what the Mishnah was. We won't go into that again. But basically, this is a long discussion of the text of the Mishnah. It goes off on tremendous tangents. Often the tangents are longer than the actual discussion of the Mishnah itself, and can really comprise any type of information. There's discussion of, biographies of great rabbis, or recipes, or an analysis of anthropological or zoological phenomena, what kind of lessons you get from the behavior of a cat, meteorological information. Really, a tremendous gamut of information is contained within the Talmud. And that's why it's known as wine. Let me show you a chart which explains why it is wine of Torah. Let's jump ahead. Here it is. Basically, because while it is ostensibly a commentary on the Mishnah per se, it really includes two other elements of Jewish thought which are combined into the overarching massive document, the Talmud. First of all, the Mishnah, of course, is essentially about law, practice, although there are a lot of Mishnayos that go into very different topics other than practice. Okay? But in order to understand that Mishnah, quite often the rabbis have to bring in midrash, which is essentially rabbinic commentary on various biblical passages. and very creative kind of commentary, much like that sign outside the yeshiva in Jerusalem. And finally, the Talmud has a tremendous amount of mystical thought. The Kabbalah, a lot of the esoteric teachings of Judaism are brought into the Talmud in the context of the discussion of the Mishnah or one of the many fascinating tangents that Talmud contains. This is kind of like a process of distillation, hence the term line of Torah, because it's something that requires effort and processing in order to access it. Jumping ahead now, just to quickly review, we saw this in the Mishnah, but let's look at it again. The Talmud is often called Shas, which is an acronym for the Hebrew phrase Shisha Sitrei, the 6 orders. And since those 6 orders apply to the Mishnah, they also apply to the Talmud, the commentary on that Mishnah. Some people sometimes confuse the Talmud with the Gemara. They are actually identical. Gemara, which is the Aramaic term meaning completion or learning, is related to the Hebrew cognate word Talmud, which comes from Limud, learning. And both of these documents sit right on top of the Mishnah. So when you buy an edition of the Talmud, you automatically get the Mishnah contained within it. I'll show you a picture of that shortly. Actually, why not? Look, I have a copy of the Talmud right here with me. This one volume of 20, the Babylonian Talmud, and well, this one's a little bit anomalous. Let me just get another one off the shelf. Go. Okay, here we go. I have one handy here. This is Tractate Shabbat. So just give you a sense of how this looks. So Tractate Shabbat is one of the longer tractates, and it goes to not 314 pages. It actually goes to double that. Let's see, this is 157. No, that's right. 314 pages. Double the folio size. Oh my gosh, I can get so much detail in, but I better not. But when you look at the whole volume here, this is the Talmudic text itself, and this is a whole bunch of commentary, including various edited versions of the Talmud, like the Alphas at the back and so on. So of a typical volume this thick, about half of it is the Talmudic pages, the rest is commentary. And of course, there is commentary on the page. I'll show you a chart of that in just a second on the Prezi. At any rate, this is a 20-volume edition, the most standard edition, the Vilna Shas. Here you can see my favorite portico drawing as well. I really enjoy it. I just feel like going my. So, back to Prezi, though, the 6 orders of the Mishnah and the Talmud basically are listed here and their topic. And as I mentioned earlier, the Talmud goes off on a tremendous amount of tangents. Can't simply think that everything dealing with marriage and divorce is in an order called Nashi. You'll find marriage and divorce in Moed and in other orders as well. It's a very fluid and flexible, or maybe a better word to use would be a very fragile and delicate structure that keeps many disparate topics going together, although in a non-linear fashion, which we expect to see in a more Greek-style textbook. At any rate, who wrote this text? Well, there are basically hundreds of authors involved. There are the original rabbis of the early period, the period of, let's say, Joshua and the elders, Pirkei Avot describes it, that will hand down teachings, and they are continued through the prophets and various scholars through a period known as the period of the Zugot, which are associated with the early Mishnah, and then the Tanaim, which are the Mishnah teachers proper, and then finally it reaches the Amoraim, or the speakers, who take all of these things and combine them into the Talmud. Another way to look at it is basically these are the transcripts of huge, massive discussions of rabbis in the various academies, both in the land of Israel and in Babylon, processing all of this material, trying to analyze the Mishnah by bringing in variant texts from the various Boraitot and Tosefta. You'll remember that from our lecture on Mishnah. Comparing them and trying to refine exactly the truth of the material as a whole. Now, I mentioned there are 2 Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud is actually a bit of a misnomer because it wasn't written particularly in Jerusalem. It was really written in the north, in the Galil region, the city of Bavaria region. But at any rate, this is an earlier version of the Talmud, which was written probably around the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. The Babylonian Talmud, written 100 or 200 years later in the Mesopotamian region, where the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers come together. The Jerusalem Talmud is not nearly as popular as the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian is considered more authoritative, primarily because it could consider the Jerusalem own deliberations, although there are many sections which are in the Jerusalem that are omitted from the Babylonian Talmud, primarily because they are not as relevant to Babylonian life. In particular, for example, the agricultural law that was related to living in the land of Israel, the sabbatical law, things like that, whereas the Babylonian Talmud is especially expanded in the area of civil and criminal law, the order of Nicaea in particular. When people say they're studying the Talmud today, they're almost invariably studying the Babylonian Talmud, although there are many scholars, of course, who look to the Jerusalem Talmud for a tremendous wealth of information that's not present in the Babylonian. So the Talmud, as it's presented, is very fascinating. I mean, a lot of people like to look at the page of the Talmud itself, and in reality, the page of the Talmud is a page of history presented in a two-dimensional format. In many ways, it's similar to the Internet, World Wide Web, because it has hypertexting, and it is possible that when you study the Talmud, you are really engaging in a massive conversation that covers millennia, literally millennia. We'll look at a text that goes back to the Mishnaic period, quoting a text from the Bible that's even earlier, that will be debated by two Talmudic rabbis, and then there will be people in the 10th century, let's say Rashi discussing it, disputed by Tosafot in the 13th century, moving up through, let's say, Rabbi Akiva Eger in early modern Europe, and all the way up to the 20th century. It's really a fascinating, really 21st century, a fascinating document that offers so much history really on a single page. The page is divided into three basic areas. There is commentary on the text. That is basically a way to try and just get a sense of what does the text say. The Talmud is written in a highly arcane Aramaic idiom that is not only is difficult because of the linguistic difference, where we no longer have Aramaic as a vernacular, which was, of course, the vernacular of the rabbis when they wrote the Talmud, but it's written in a highly coded and condensed version that is especially useful for oral retention, because I should not omit to mention this is oral Torah. It was committed to writing only centuries after it was discussed. So in the oral format, it's really highly compressed, often with one word signifying an entire paragraph of meaning, and it takes many years to be able to learn to decode text, which incidentally is presented entirely without punctuation. That makes it even easier to figure out. Then there is a second level of discussion on the Talmudic page, so-called analysis. And that's especially something you see with Tosafot, where text will be compared. Tosafot will say something like, wait a minute, how could it say this on this page of the Talmud when 30 pages ago we saw something totally different? Or even 30 pages later, we will see something different. The concept of time, of linear relationship of ideas is not truly present in the Talmud. It's one huge gestalt whole, like the sea, that you have to really approach any shoreline, and eventually you will reach the other shore, but quite often you have to experiment with swimming in hot water or cold water, deep water, water filled with massive marine life and jellyfish and sharks, all kinds of things like that. Getting off topic. And the other thing you'll find in the Talmud is often coded material. We'll talk more about this as we get later in this course, but codes basically are an attempt to kind of digest all this material and say, all right, let's organize this and say, what exactly is the bottom line? How are we supposed to behave? Is this chicken kosher or not? Can this couple be legally wed or not? And the codes, which often appear on the page, or as cross-references to the codes that are printed elsewhere, will tell you that kind of information. What is the bottom line? The Talmud, like the Mishnah, often does not get to the bottom line, often does not produce a sentence that says, after discussing this for 10 pages, we have decided X. That does occur occasionally in the Talmud, but more often than not, it does not. And it is up to the student, guided by a teacher, a qualified teacher, to understand what did the Talmud just say after all? It's really not so simple. Here's a look at the Talmudic page. I showed you a copy in my own Talmud, but here's from Tractate Brachot. Really, we could spend a lot of time talking about all of the details, but just to give you a quick look, you'll see that the Mishnah occupies the top part of the central portion of the text, and that's, of course, the ancient document that comes from the 3rd century. Then following it is the Gemara, that's signified by a larger print, Gimel and Mem for Gemara or Talmud, which is a discussion of that Mishnah. Now, that section of the Gemara can and does go on for many, many pages before the Gemara then concludes and a new Mishnah is presented. On the right-hand side, it'll be on the left-hand side and other pages, always on the center of the binding happening in the Talmud, sort of unpacking that really dense text for 11th century readers. Now, of course, we often need commentaries on Rashi to unpack it for 21st century readers. And then on the opposite side, you typically have Tosafot, which are the school, it's not just a single person, a school of rabbis who analyze the text, who try to break it down, criticize it, question it, turn it every which way, and try to get, wring every last little bit of truth out of it. Tosafot includes, among others, Rashi's own descendants. And then typically on the outside, sometimes squeezed on the inside, and even between the margins, cross-references other texts, such as the Code. And that's a typical page of Talmud. Okay, there's a lot more to say about how the Talmud was studied, role of women in the study of Talmud, but I fear I'm running out of time right now, so I'm going to stop here, and I certainly encourage you to read more about this amazing document. Hello, everyone. We're going to discuss different topics. We're going to go into the early Islamic period, which is going to be extremely important for Jewish history because it's going to cover several centuries of Jewish activity under the Muslim rule. And really, it's a period of tremendous achievements, and on the other hand, one of tremendous potential that is perhaps not realized in the later medieval and early modern period. But we're going to go into that more in the next module of this course. For now, though, we're going to concentrate on the early Islamic period, which means basically from the 7th century through the 10th century, and then we're going to pick up a little bit more later on in the course. So to begin with, when we look at this period overall, perhaps the most misunderstood issue of the Jews in the Muslim period is whether or not it was a period of great